Today on the Good Roads podcast, we're honored to be joined by Ontario Regional Chief Abram Benedict. Chief Benedict serves as a political leader for the Chiefs of Ontario, representing 133 First Nations across the province. He's a tireless advocate for Indigenous rights and partnerships with a strong focus on advancing economic development, infrastructure, and intergovernmental relations. In addition to his provincial leadership, Chief Benedict also serves as a Grand Chief of the Mohawk Council of Akwesasne, bringing a wealth of experience and insight to the table. We're thrilled to have him with us today to discuss the intersections of Indigenous leadership, transportation, and community development in Ontario. Welcome, Chief Benedict.
Good morning. Thank you.
So, Andrew and I, we just want to kind of start from the very beginning here, just for all of our listeners who perhaps aren't fully aware of who the Chiefs of Ontario are. I feel like everybody should, but just in case, for those not familiar with the Chiefs of Ontario, what role does the organization serve in First Nations governance?
Absolutely. Well, thank you for the opportunity to talk about the Chiefs of Ontario and some of our priorities. The Chiefs of Ontario is an organization that's an advocacy organization that's been around actually for about 50 years now. The position of Ontario Regional Chief is an elected position by the 133 First Nations. Every 3 years, select a representative who's going to support and lead them for 3 years. And so predominantly the work we do is government relations, liaisons, supporting the 133 communities through advocacy, lobby efforts, opening the doors for communities to meet with federal government, provincial government. We bring forward the community's collective voice in our region on a number of policy issues, legislative issues that affect our many communities across Ontario. And so the organization of the Chiefs of Ontario has administrative offices in Toronto. We have an on-reserve office in Nipissing, and for myself, work between that location and my home in Akwesasne.
All right. Yeah. Now, so Good Roads is a municipal association. Our members are municipalities, and our listeners are mostly municipal. Just generally, how would you characterize the current state of the relationship between First Nations and municipalities in Ontario?
Yeah. Well, so, as in the role I have as the Ontario Regional Chief, one of the important things that to me is to create relationships between, federal, provincial, municipal, private, groups that have same interest of our community, either collectively or individually as well. And so, the relationship between municipalities and First Nations varies across the province. I mean, obviously, our province is very big. We have a lot of northern communities, central Ontario and southern Ontario. And so, one of the things that I've continuously, spoke about at various forums, including at the Good Roads, at the conference that was recently held, was about, relationship building, forming those alliances with First Nation communities, talking about the priorities of community, talking about the priorities between the municipalities and First Nations. And the other thing is that, for a wide variety of reasons, there's a number of First Nation folks who live in municipal settings, in the municipalities. And for whether it be for economic reasons, for, job reasons, for health reasons, reasons of overcrowding, or simply, want to reside in those cities or towns or municipalities, what have you. So it's important that, leadership in the municipal settings acknowledges that as well, that there's a generally a First Nation population within their jurisdiction, and that, part of Truth and Reconciliation is bringing together, with First Nations, non-First Nations, and finding those commonalities that we can support one another. And there's obviously a big distinction as well in service delivery models that for First Nations is quite unique. And it's important that municipalities learn from that. And that starts with relationships, having conversations with, elected leadership, with the chief and council, as well as the administrators of municipalities, the CEOs of municipalities. There's equivalents in many First Nations. And so those relationships are extremely important.
And you mentioned that the relationship, but also the fact that there's First Nations people living in municipal settings or like off reserve. What are some of like the unique challenges, I guess, that are presented there, and how does the Chiefs of Ontario kind of deal with that?
Well, so I mean, we're an advocacy group that helps lobby for different policies, regulations, or what have you that impact our people. But one of the things that I encourage a lot of as well is if there's municipal leaders, organizations, nonprofits that want, or including business organizations and that want to interact with community, learn a bit more about community that don't know where to start. I mean, I've been very open about reaching out to my office, and we can help with that. We can definitely help create those linkages, bring together the leadership, bring together the leadership with the community, and find ways that you can start building those relationships. So I think that that's some of the work that I do as the regional chief in many aspects, but also in the collective aspect is ensuring that the mandates that's given to me as the regional chief is executed, through government, through government relations, whether it be federal, provincial, or even including municipal.
Oh, right on. And have there been any kind of joint advocacy efforts with municipalities or municipal associations? Good Roads is one, because we do. It's funny, you're talking about government relations and advocacy, and I'm thinking, oh, this is a lot of stuff that we do.
Mm-hmm.
Has there been any kind of joint advocacy efforts? I know you've only been in this position now for about a year, I think.
Just under a year, so about 10 months.
10 months, yeah. So, have there been any examples, maybe before your time, where kind of municipalities or municipal associations and the Chiefs of Ontario have kind of jointly advocated or partnered to kind of achieve some of those goals where there is kind of that overlap between the municipal sector and some of those more specific Indigenous or First Nations kind of concerns?
There have been off and on through the past. A lot of times, when we have come together, is generally around commonalities around government legislation that's not, supported by certain, whether it be organizations that represent municipalities, organizations that represent certain interest groups. I mean, we've generally come together with them in those areas regularly. I mean, we have in the past with AMO. I think there has been some interactions with Good Roads as well in the past. Nothing super concrete, but one of the things under my mandate is that I want to make sure that we're formalizing relationships and that we are having those regular conversations, that our leadership is part of, or our technicians is part of, different working groups or circles that are within various organizations, so that there is a First Nations perspective on that. I know that within a Good Roads Association as well as an AMO and other organizations as well, there sometimes are First Nation members who are in there that are either elected leadership or hold a technical role within municipal or nonprofit areas, and they help support that. But I can say that sometimes that is met with a bit of challenge as well, because they don't always want to speak for First Nations broadly, and so I think that's why it's important that the organization like the Chiefs of Ontario is brought in to help support that work, because through our internal processes there are some things that we can speak more broadly about a regional approach versus an individual community approach. And so sometimes those matters, whether it be on policy around environmental or policy around, infrastructure projects that, broadly affect the region, that's issues that we can speak to more broadly. But there are sometimes other things that more affect more different geographical areas, such as the North, right? I mean, there's some policies we have in the North around various issues that don't apply to us here in the South. And so, we can help navigate that. And so, I applaud, acknowledge, and support the First Nations persons that are part of organizations. In fact, I know that you have a few leaders within your organization that have come from municipalities that are prepared to help support. But I know that in some conversations I've had, not particularly with the leaders in yours, but I mean, they sometimes are a bit more, unsure if they should speak about First Nation lens completely. And I think that's where the organization at Chiefs of Ontario is extremely helpful in those situations.
Yeah, and excuse me, and I think that's something. It's a nice segue into something that we've kind of been working on. I know we chatted with you about it as well a couple of weeks ago, and that in Good Roads, as an organization, we've kind of made the choice, and our membership has kind of voted on it, or passed it, I should say, and that we're going to actually be having some First Nations representation officially on our board of directors. You mentioned that we have some First Nations individuals, some leaders, Mayor Fort, Councillor Murray, but they're actually there in their municipal capacity and not in their kind of First Nations capacity, and we don't want to kind of over rely on those people and have them speak for, like you said, all groups, when we know there's big variations between north, south, central, east, west, whatever. So we're really kind of looking forward to that and having that kind of diverse perspective, or that kind of just to be able to kind of help, and it will help people like Andrew and I too when we're doing our kind of advocacy and government relations work, to have that perspective within the organization. But then also we would still like to, have a partnership with the Chiefs of Ontario as well. But yeah, we're moving forward, I guess, in a way to kind of try to bring that those perspectives within our decision making.
Mm-hmm. No, and I appreciate that, and we're happy to support that work. And through the meeting that we've had with the board and the president, I mean, we're well on our way, and those are initiatives that we're going to continue to offer and support to other organizations who have common interests like us.
Yeah, and I think that's a really positive contribution that you can make to. Again, I can only speak for Good Roads, but when as an organization, when you're trying to kind of move forward and incorporate just different perspectives, especially when it comes to First Nations and Indigenous people and groups, and the calls to action, truth and reconciliation. Sometimes you don't know where to start, and having an organization like the Chiefs of Ontario, and you specifically, Chief Benedict, have been very open and to collaborating and to answering questions and to kind of help guiding organizations who, like I said, may not know where to begin, or navigating it is a bit maybe difficult. Some of these uncharted waters for organizations such as ours, and yeah, we very much appreciate that. And I guess if there's any other of our listeners, if you're part of an organization who wants to do this sort of thing, I highly recommend you reach out to Chief Benedict and his office, because they've been very kind of helpful in helping us move forward on this.
Absolutely, I appreciate that, and we have a website as well. Myself, I use social media to share information, and that's the Ontario Regional Chief Abram Benedict. That any person, whether leadership or municipal administration, wants to look for some supports, we're definitely here to help.
Right on.
You'd spoken just previously about the common goals that organizations have, municipal associations and municipalities. And I know one of the things Good Roads is working on concerns the infrastructure deficit, and we've talked about that a lot in the past. And at our conference, we released the latest numbers that we work on to talk about like the total infrastructure deficit in the province. And I know this is something that the Chiefs of Ontario has worked on before, because we talk about the infrastructure deficit from the municipal perspective, where there's a huge gap, and it's a forever growing, but there's a much bigger gap between the municipal sector and in First Nations communities. This is something that you spoke a bit at the conference. Just wondering if you could talk about it again here.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's, unfortunately, there's no secret that, the infrastructure gap between on reserve and off reserve is quite large. I mean, over nationally, I think it's about $350 billion. And that was actually several years ago. I mean, now we know that with the costs and, all of the other things that are impacting our daily lives and in infrastructure, or frankly, all aspects, it's probably quite a bit higher. But in Ontario specifically, we're around $50 billion alone for ourselves, infrastructure gap, and that means that the infrastructure in First Nation communities, from roads to schools, water treatment plants, wastewater, quite basic infrastructure. It needs a significant investment to bring it up to at least the minimum standard of what many Ontarians or Canadians enjoy in their communities, which is, it's very sadly to say that this is nothing new. I mean, we have been, talking about, boil water advisories in Ontario, which we have the most in any province across Canada. the most boil water advisories exist here in Ontario, which is, unheard of. We've been talking, unfortunately, years about overcrowding in First Nation communities. This is real, right? I mean, and this continues to be an extreme challenge, and this was before, every municipal organization and government level of government was talking about not having enough homes, right? I mean, this is a big thing right now, is building more homes for all the people. I mean, First Nations have been struggling with this for a long time. And then we add the cost of living on top of that, the supply chain issues that I think that, the pandemic was a real changer in many aspects. I mean, that drove costs up, but also that exploited, so much about overcrowding in homes. I mean, this was for Ontarians or Canadians abroad, was very challenging, but First Nations people have been, unfortunately in many communities have, 3 generations, 4 generations in homes. And so, during the pandemic, it was clearly very difficult to isolate. And, so this was how communities became impacted so much. And this is all a part of the infrastructure gap, right? I mean, that continues to exist there. Schools, First Nations want to be in community learning in school, taught by their own people. But when you have schools that are either, we're only built for 25 years, are now going on 40, or you've brought in portables that were only temporary, that have become permanent and are 20, are 15, 20 years old. I mean, this is the realities that we face. And so, it's a part of the work that we do at the Chiefs of Ontario is bringing that information forward, but also finding solutions. There's lots of communities that want prosperity. There are lots of communities that are, in the time and era that we're in, are resource rich. There's lots of minerals and things that the government wants to fast track these days. But First Nations need to be involved in that, and they also need to be part of the conversation right from day one, so that those jobs, the economy that's created by the opening of mines or the creation of bringing community power to communities, you back that up for 2 seconds and think about it. I mean, most Ontarians enjoy having electricity quite regularly, right? And I know we had in the Barrie area there in Muskoka, there was a power outage for 7-8 days. I mean, people were losing their marbles. We have this, unfortunately, in communities that run off diesel generators, in this era, right? I mean, so we talk about infrastructure gaps around that. I mean, that's a huge investment, though, to bring sustainable power to communities. And
a huge investment and a huge work on just like on the ground, create partnerships. I'm pretty familiar with the Wate project that we've been doing, and I know that took decades to get off the ground. Constant back and forth between different governments, connecting. I think what is it, like 17 First Nation communities, and so you talk about some of them are still burning wood to create their electricity. So it's like about time that project got off the ground. So whenever that pops up in the news, I'm perking my ears up, because I'm glad that it's actually making huge progress. So that's part of the side. But yeah, everything you said it's another part of the reason why we have a lot of First Nations communities spreading out into municipalities, just because there's just lack of resources. So they're all going to where they can find it, and where there's more space and where there's more availability for services, right?
Yep. The other thing too, though, and it's kind of boggles my mind when we talk about infrastructure, right? I mean, many communities face, not being able to expand because of infrastructure that supports expansion, right? And community, sadly, many First Nation communities have been in that situation for a very long time. Either water treatment plants or wastewater treatment plants that have been maxed out, a decade ago, but still continue to operate. The electrical systems, many folks don't realize that, when you build more homes, you need more power, which means that, there's part of a critical infrastructure, has to be part of that. So First Nations that, are on the end of the line, that are maxed out, again, are in those challenging positions where you can't build new infrastructure because there's not enough power to bring to them, right? Even if they may be connected, or a diesel generator too, right? I mean, you only got to bring in another, big massive generator to create more power to power a new school. Like we're people don't realize those they're all connected, and so our communities face those daily. And the other challenge too, that's and I think is huge for a number of our northern communities as well as our non-indigenous, is the climate change, right? I mean, we have forest fires is massive, is quite an issue now. Flooding, like this year, we have a number of our communities out as we speak right now that have been evacuated early because of flooding, and this is climate adaptation is real. Climate change is real, and this is where we also rely on those relationships, because what's happening is that I mean, our community members are having to be flown into many frankly, municipalities across Ontario, and sometimes in neighboring jurisdictions, and I think that's where those relationships is very important, because so when that does happen, you have the municipal organizations, you have the municipal supports, but also the nonprofit supports are collaborating, and they're talking with folks that they've already chatted about with before about different issues. It's extremely important that we build those linkages between leadership, administration, nonprofit, community partners to support one another.
And is there ever in these scenarios that you just mentioned where people are flown from communities when there's natural disasters, and obviously some people are happy to help, but is there ever any in this era when there's for example, shelters already kind of overflowing, and even any municipality you go to has big homeless populations these days, especially kind of coming out of the pandemic? Is there ever any tension between local groups and for the maybe almost feeling some resentfulness to having large groups of First Nations kind of come in and because of these disasters, for example? Does that ever happen, or is it kind of everyone's kind of willing to kind of do their part because acknowledging that?
Well, I mean, these things, are, best laid plans never go well. There's a lot of things in there. I mean, when we have, multiple disasters happening, we have several hundreds of people, kind of having to be, evacuated from communities, especially in times of, in tourism time, which means hotel and resources are generally already pretty tapped, creates it creates a quite challenging situation. So I think that, that continues to occur. There's not and I'm not preaching to anybody that doesn't notice already, but there's not a municipality that's not always struggling with homelessness and overcrowding and not enough places for people to live on the regular, right? And so
Right.
to add a couple hundred more in some places is very difficult, and so we face that challenges as well. The other thing is too is that for many of these communities. Folks don't realize that when you live in a small, remote community and you're evacuated out, like unfortunately, some communities are quite regularly evacuated, which is not acceptable, and some are less regularly. But when you have people these are big culture shocks too, as well. You're leaving a small community where you know everybody, you're in your home, and you're going into a big city center, right? I mean, there's a
Right.
lot of risk in this sort of thing, and human trafficking continues to be real. Exploitation is real. Racism is real. Like racism is live and well in Canada, and it's unfortunate. So our people face that as well, and so there's a lot of partners needed to support emergency situations in many aspects. And this is some of the advocacy work that we do in trying to find the a pathway forward that's going to help support not only the municipality, our First Nations, but also the people on the ground that are having to deal with this day to day.
Okay. Well, let's. Why don't we kind of shift the conversation a bit, because you had mentioned kind of economic development in a way, and we kind of want to talk about that, opportunities for resource development and kind of prosperity and that sort of stuff. And I know obviously that differs as well depending on where you are and which communities are in favor of certain projects or not. But something that always kind of comes up is like the Ring of Fire and the areas kind of around that, and building the infrastructure, the roads to some of these communities so they have year-round roads. But then there is also kind of that tension between various communities, where some are supportive and some aren't. And then with everything happening now with internationally with the U.S. and tariffs and all that, the provincial government seems to kind of be reinvigorated and trying to kind of get projects built quicker and that sort of thing. We've seen the introduction of Bill 5 and some of these special economic zones that they've outlined, where a lot of processes can be kind of essentially ignored or they don't exist. Some of those are environmental, and I know that the Chiefs of Ontario have kind of weighed in on this already. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I want to make it clear is that, communities want prosperity as well. They want to create economic drivers for their communities. They want to be part of project development. One of the messages that I continue to bring forward to, municipal, federal, and provincial partners is First Nations need to be at the table from the beginning. I mean, we have seen time and time again where projects have been developed, from concept to construction, and, communities have not been involved. And we have seen many examples of where this has gone, not so well. In fact, we have either direct action on the ground, or we end up in systems like the courts, for a very long time, and when there could have been a pathway for it that would get everybody where they want to be. And so, First Nations need to be included from the beginning. Now, when we talk about the resources in the north, and currently the Ontario government has tabled, like you mentioned, legislation around Bill 5, and the premier has been very vocal about unleashing the resources in the north, and the federal government, in fact, has said a bit about this as well, and that is all in an effort to drive the economy locally and make sure that there's jobs here in Ontario. And as the trade war continues on, and the impacts are felt in so many areas. And so, there's a couple of things around that. I mean, the Chiefs of Ontario is will be doing a presentation at the committee on Bill 5, talking about the impacts of it, and that it could potentially have for our communities and the rights that we have. And it's important that folks understand is that the First Nations have a relationship with the federal government as what we consider as the Crown. And so the Crown, the federal government is basically an agent of the Crown, and they have a fiduciary responsibility to First Nations people, and the province has that same responsibility as well. And so, we have court decisions that has upheld that when governments take action or make decisions that could impact First Nation rights, and those rights include land rights, they must consult with the First Nations community. And so what we see is with Bill 5 is that potentially what could happen is that the decision to give permission, or in situations where it'd be a proponent have to make an application to the government for permission to do an activity, whether it be mining, exploration, or to build, or what have you, the government now has made a decision to give a permit to do a work. And so with Bill 5, it essentially seems to eliminate all of the application processes. Well, go build some critical infrastructure, or go build, a mine. And so it doesn't mean that the obligation of the government to consult is now absolved and doesn't exist. But what it does take away is kind of where that trigger point is, where they have to start the consultation. And so this is why it's extremely important that, the government, proponents, developers, investors realize that there still continues to be an obligation to consult First Nations, and we argue that the free, prior, informed consent. What that means is that before a project is to proceed, and that the First Nations have to consent to it, and that doesn't mean that it's a yes or no, that we want it to go or we don't want it to go. We want it, in many cases, we want it to go, but we want it to go like this, and that means protecting sacred sites. That means ensuring that these plans include safeguards for drinking water. It means that these plans include that you're going to go around places where we have endangered species as you go to access the site. That's what we want to ensure that the land is protected, that the water is protected, and so that it's not just bulldozing right into the middle of pristine land, driving over endangered animals, endangered species, leaking into the waters and destroying the waters. It's making sure that all the safeguards continue to be there in accordance with our customs and traditions. Because remember, our people have been on the land since time immemorial and know in many aspects, and you'll listen to developers, and they'll know that, like with water movement, with migration movement, a lot of our elders who have lived in many areas, specific geographical areas that have been there forever, know when things are going to happen and when they're not. And these are not archaeological studies or, assessments that dictate these things. These are traditional teachings, and this is for real. I've talked to several folks where it's like, oh, well, we should have listened to them because this is actually what they said was going to happen. That's what happened. You build a water treatment plant somewhere and it starts sinking, or the water's not always available because the elders said, you know what? I mean, this spot is not where it should be. And so that's why it's extremely important that First Nation communities be involved right from the beginning, through development, through construction, and right through to execution, and frankly, all the way to the end of the not to the decommissioning of the asset as well. I mean, one of the things we don't ever think about is that, and I've made this very clear in my presentation, that when I talk about infrastructure, is that the government, the regulators, the investors, the builders, they will come and go. They will come and go. They will come in. They'll build they'll build the roads. They'll build the plant, or they'll build the mine. The end of the day, the only people that will continue to be there is the First Nations people. And so when the mine is dry, when the well is dry, when all the trees are gone, the only people that will continue to be there is the First Nations. And that's why it's extremely important that they continue to be there from the beginning, right straight to the decommissioning of it.
Hmm. Yeah, and I know this came up in your discussion at our conference a couple of weeks ago, but I'll just kind of state it again: is that it's the duty to consult with First Nations is not just something; it's not just a checkbox as part of a project. And you've really outlined there why it's important to include that the local knowledge from the start, and it's not only for the benefit of those groups, but for the project as well. So if you are a developer or a mining company, it is beneficial to you to consult with First Nations groups from the start and include them throughout the entire process. And I think, yeah, everything that you've outlined there is just really, really kind of hammers that home.
One of the other aspects that I'll say, and we've seen this in large transmission projects, not hydro, but the large electrical transmission projects, is community ownership. Right, and that First Nations have a stake in the ownership,
Right.
and this definitely is a model that needs to be used in many other aspects. Not only does it create economic driver for the community itself, they also have skin in the game, essentially, right? I mean, this project success means success for the community as well. And so that's extremely important to remember as well as projects are being developed, because First Nations want to have success, want to have prosperity. In order to do that, make them part owners in projects, and so that when the project is comes to fruition, when that there are rewards to be had, First Nation, the community itself is receiving those rewards as well. Because otherwise, then if there's just consultations, impact benefit agreements, or some sort of smaller agreements, the company can make significant investments into infrastructure. At the end of the day, have no yield or return. There's the community is in the same position when they went in and when before the project started, and if it doesn't advance, then they're in the same spot anyway. So I think that community ownership is extremely important. This is something that needs to be considered in all projects.
And on that note, but also kind of shifting it back to the municipal sector and partnerships with the municipal sector, I recall something that you had, or perhaps it was Mayor Towndale, Justin Towndale from the city of Cornwall, who had mentioned kind of this joint kind of partnership that I think it was Akwesasne and the city of Cornwall had in redeveloping waterfront or decommissioned federal lands. That's a bit different than what we were just talking about immediately with those resource development. But this is kind of an opportunity where, or an instance where there's an opportunity to kind of partner in a joint kind of way. And I think, if I remember correctly, you can correct me if I'm wrong, Chief Benedict. I think what I recall was that the Akwesasne received some ownership of some of this waterfront land, and it was jointly developed in a way that benefited both the city and the First Nation community?
So what happened in that situation was that the federal government owned property. In this case, it was a deep water port located in the Sea of Cornwall, and had been owned by the federal government for several years, and so through the divestiture program that the federal government has, which they've been divesting a number of federal assets across Canada over the last 10 years, went to the city of Cornwall, and went to Akwesasne and said, we have this property here, we're prepared to give it to you in joint ownership, and for you to develop together. And so the city of Cornwall and Akwesasne agreed to that, and now we're joint owners of this property. But I will say though that that was about 9 years ago that occurred. And actually, it happened. The federal government had made the same proposition probably about 5 to 7, maybe 8 years prior, and the municipality and Akwesasne would not agree to a 50-50 ownership. And so the federal government said, we are not going to give one party more ownership than the other one. And then the federal government said, we will just walk away. And so the opportunity came back, and the government, the government of Akwesasne, the government of the city of Cornwall, agreed that they would do 50-50. And the reason why I share that is because that's, the relationship from the first offer to the second offer had changed, and that there was more of an understanding of between Akwesasne and Cornwall. The leadership understood the importance of working together with the local First Nation, which happened to be Akwesasne, and then so when the federal government came back and said, we want to give both of you this property, 15 acres of land with a deep water port on it, but it would only be a 50-50. At that time, Akwesasne and the city of Cornwall said yes. And I think that, having those established relationships brings about other opportunities.
So that to me is like kind of a good example of when a municipality and a First Nation kind of successfully collaborate on something. And you mentioned that the relationship was really kind of the foundation of this. And you said that maybe a decade ago that wasn't there.
That's right.
Is it what changed in that decade? Is it the fact that maybe more non-Indigenous people or non-First Nations people are more aware of what's happening, or was it just different personalities, or maybe a combination of both? Like what and has that been happening maybe in other instances across the province where in the past maybe there wasn't that kind of mutual respect and understanding and want for a partnership, and whereas now that is that happening more? Like, do you see that happening anywhere else?
Well, salvagely, I like to believe that they're a pretty cool Grand Chief there, Connecticut, that. And that great opportunities come with great leadership, but
Right.
I would say that the times have changed as well. 2 decades ago, when I became a member of the council of the Mock Council of Akwesasne, this was about 19 years ago, and there was no way that the municipality and Akwesasne were ever going to be talking about anything joint. Frankly, they existed beside each other, but very little relations, and in fact, sometimes it was adversarial over certain things that didn't make a lot of sense, anyways. But fast forwarding, we as much as this people sometimes don't, and I say First Nations don't particularly like the word. It's we're in an era of reconciliation, right? I mean, we've heard that so many times now, but I mean the reality is that things, we have the Truth Reconciliation Commission has made the recommendations in that time. We have seen residential school is a big part of that, as we've seen the 215 from Kamloops, and that was a fresh reminder of how delicate and how real residential school era was. I mean, there's lots. The federal government has always, said that First Nations relationships are extremely important, has made, significant investments and changes in policy to support that. I mean, so, there, and the other thing is too, though, is that, I've always said this when I was the Grand Chief of Akwesasne, was that, the times of doing things in silo have come to an end for lots of reasons, and including the financial reasons, because you can't afford to do things alone anymore. There has to be collaboration, because there's the cost of living is through the roof, the cost of building is super significant, and there's just not enough resources to go around to do things on your own, and you have to find partners. And so there's a lot of things that have changed in the decade that have brought together First Nations and municipalities, or that should bring together First Nations and municipalities to be able to support one another. And the other thing is too, though, is that the population growth, as we mentioned earlier, there's a lot more First Nations living in municipal settings for a wide variety of reasons. And why not? Why would you not work closely with those communities that part of your citizens come from? And we see that in so many different areas.
And plus, it's just like you're kind of neighbors. Like I know Cornwall and Akwesasne, you're just separated by the bridge, right?
Yeah.
And it's like it's similar right across the province, where it's just like a lot of municipalities and First Nations communities are living right side by side, and they kind of wait for the opportunity to work together when you could be building the relationship the entire time. So hopefully we'll see more of these partnerships going forward, and hopefully there is a bit of a culture change nowadays. But you touched a little bit on reconciliation there, and that's like one of those foundational things that we should all be working on in the province. To you, what does meaningful reconciliation look like on the municipal level, from your perspective?
Well, it really is about direct action. It is inclusion. Many, municipalities do a lot of planning, whether or not they like it or not. The province dictates a lot of different activities that need to happen for the municipality, and First Nations be included in that. Be included in the planning stages, be included in the outreach, do the direct outreach. I know that, engagement is always difficult. We struggle with this in community as well. But it's one of those efforts that need to be continuously trying to do right. And that is, I've heard over the years, we called the band office and we never called a callback. Well, you know what? I can tell you that being a community chief, and we has quite a large infrastructure, but the phone never stops ringing. And there's lots of inquiries going into the chief's office or the band office for lots of things, right? And so, not that it's completely acceptable to not return calls, but there's a lot of pressing calls that come into the community. And so, that's why it is important that, there'll be a couple of attempts. There's, social events that occur, invite them out, because, it should not always be issue driven, right? Back to my story earlier about, the Akwesasne and Cornwall, forming the relationship, it doesn't have to be built based on specific issues. Frankly, it's better to have a relationship without the issues, because that's when, when things are flying around, that's when emotions are high, and that's when, sometimes, rash decisions are made, and that's in any setting. And so having a relationship already existing before there's an issue is extremely important. And so, I think that around reconciliation is extremely important, is having the engagement aspect, the respect issue as well. One of the things that the city of Cornwall did, as well as they did for their staff, was they done some training, basically, training for their staff to understand about, truth and reconciliation, what the TRC does, what does that mean, who is Akwesasne, what more about the community. And when I was in Akwesasne, we spent a lot of time doing that, as educating not only Cornwall folks, but a lot of the municipal partners, the federal government, provincial partners, about Akwesasne and the uniqueness and why certain things are the way they are. And so reconciliation is about that, but also about action as well. And I think that, inclusion is an extremely big part of that, but also, through the development of plans. I know that in the city of Cornwall, they're developing reconciliation action plan right now. Some municipalities have adopted the Truth and Reconciliation as a framework for the work that they do. These are actions, right, and that I think that municipalities can consider. The other thing is too, though, is that in many settings, having First Nations included or partners in service delivery or development is extremely helpful as well. I mean, a joint project in the city or the township or what have you that has First Nations at the table, either as a program provider or there could be ownership. I mean, that's a little bit different, but brings more attention to those looking over those applications.
Hmm. Yeah, and it's really nice to hear those kind of examples that you've mentioned, because a lot of times when we hear reconciliation, and this is where I kind of personally get slightly annoyed, is you just get like a land acknowledgement and then there's just nothing else happens. It's just like, oh, we did our part. We're on the right side here. It's like, no, but the actions have to kind of, if you're going to do the land acknowledgement, there has to be some actions to kind of follow that. So it's nice to hear that municipalities like Cornwall are doing that for their making their staff take that kind of training. It's an education, because it is a process, I think, to get people where they need to be, to get that to that level of understanding. I know here at Good Roads, our staff and I think our board are going to be doing some kind of training as well. I think it's called the 4 Seasons training we're going to be doing. And I know I've taken that University of Alberta Indigenous Canada course, and Andrew's done some training as well. So I think having that kind of understanding, even just at the staff level of all these organizations, because there's decisions being made all the time, and when you don't have that understanding, it makes its way, I guess, up when it shouldn't. Certain things can just be stopped or said or done at a kind of a lower level. So incorporating all that into organizations, I think, is very important, because it leads to some of these kind of direct actions that you've been mentioning, which also does take leadership. Let's not take away from that. We do need some good leaders, and we need some respectful leaders and all that kind of stuff to kind of help kind of move forward in this kind of era of reconciliation that you're in. And you mentioned that First Nations groups are kind of, they don't even like the word anymore of reconciliation, just maybe because it is sometimes it is a bit too performative in a sense. So I guess it is nice to hear those stories of municipalities actually taking action and putting in the work.
Yeah, I would say too, though, at a political level, and I've raised this. I understand that sometimes organizations have restrictions or limitations on advocacy, but I mean, First Nations are good advocates and lobbyists themselves as well. And so, aligning with organizations politically is not necessarily a bad thing. Understanding that sometimes there are restrictions, but having those folks, saying the same message as you can be very helpful. And I bring that to my leadership all the time as well, because in reverse, right, having municipal partners saying the same concerns as us is helpful. And earlier we talked about Bill 5. We've heard lots of concerns around this, lots of opposition to it. Unfortunately, I think that we're going to end up in a position where down the road, we're going to see the impacts of Bill 5 in its operation, when it's being operationalized, when permits are no longer required, and that approvals will now be given, more broadly, will be done in special zones. There's going to be some, unless there's a waiver from, this broad overarching, carte blanche approval, we're going to see some real challenges in that. And, an environmental aspect is huge, because, our people have our connection to the land, our first peoples of the land, but also it's a sacred responsibility that we have to protect Mother, to protect our waters. And, one of the things I'm very concerned and fearful about around, Bill 5, sorry, is that, Ontario experienced one of the worst water disasters, several decades ago now, but, that was a lack of regulation and oversight and resourcing. Right. I mean, and so many systemic failures that created that. I mean, and so as the government has the ability to not follow certain processes in the name of prosperity, in the name of development. We have to be very careful. We can't sidestep approvals for very fundamentally important reasons, right? And we can't be having large watersheds of clean water in Ontario contaminated because there was no oversight and protection of those resources. And our communities are super concerned about this. I mean, again, to my story earlier, governments, decision makers, investors, companies, they will come and go. The people that won't come and go is the First Nations. They will continue to be there. So as the
Right.
mines are built in the middle of, very pristine, very protected area with lots of watersheds there, with lots of clean drinking water, when that mine is now empty and has all the contaminants left behind, the First Nation people will be the only ones left there. And so there needs to be some real considerations on this. I publicly say all the time, it feels like First Nations are the only ones fighting the environmental aspects in this country, and that's because we have a sacred responsibility to protect them.
Yeah, and I think the a good I shouldn't say a good example, but a really terrible example, or a good example but terrible situation is the mercury poisoning in
Grassy Narrows.
that's Grassy Narrows. That's what,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, it's a perfect example of that. I mean, it's a pulp mill, I believe, that's been slowly poisoning the water for a very long time, and it's still happening. And
I guarantee you that a single person who was part of that, or that developed it, to operated it, is gone. The only people
yeah,
that's still there is Grassy Narrows.
right, exactly. Okay, well, Chief Benedict, I think we're getting close to the end of our time here. Before we wrap up, is there anything else you wanted to kind of leave our listeners with, and maybe perhaps something you had mentioned earlier or at the conference that you just want to reiterate before we wrap this up?
Well, I mean, I appreciate the opportunity. I say miigwech to you, go out for the opportunity. The Chiefs Ontario here is an organization that's here to help support our 133 First Nations across Ontario. Our communities want to bring prosperity. Our communities want to be part of development. Many of our communities are part of development already, and we have lots of lessons to be learned from good practices in our own communities. And so, in the time of a trade war, in the time of wanting to make sure that we protect the Canadian economy, the Ontario economy, but also protect our sovereignty, is extremely important to our communities as well. Let's not forget that every community in Canada has its own is an own sovereign nation in itself, and that's extremely important. And so that we recognize and acknowledge that that inherent jurisdiction that communities have, and that they're here to help support, and again through the free, prior, informed consent, and that's about making sure, how do we get to the consent aspect, and that's ensuring that communities are there from the beginning, from the development, to make sure that that our sacred burial grounds are protected, that the water, the clean drinking water is protected, and so that we can get to the consent of a project development. And so many, there seems to be a whole notion that, First Nations don't want development. They want, it's a no matter what. It's not a no matter what. It's how do we get there? In that sitting down, having respectful conversations, learning from one another, understanding why this is so important to people, to the First Nations people, to the community, to the elders. That's because, again, when these developments are done and gone, the only people that are going to continue to be there is our communities, and they want to make sure that land, that prosperity is available for our future generations just as much as any other Ontarian or Canadian wants.
Well said. Well, Chief Benedict, thank you for joining us today and sharing your insights and your leadership. Your perspective on collaboration, community development, and the role of Indigenous voices in shaping Ontario's future is invaluable. We appreciate your time and look forward to continuing the conversation. Thanks to our listeners for tuning in to the Good Roads podcast. We'll leave it at that.